Our guest in the studio, Jeremy Dalley, is a physician assistant, and he is with Tripp Family Medicine here in Twin Falls, Idaho, which is located on Fillmore Street. That's on the north side of the Fillmore Street, on the north side of the city, directly across from the main post office. You can probably see the big sign out front if you're coming out of the post office. In fact, you really can't miss it. Jeremy, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Want to point out, Bill Colley with Jeremy. If you have a question or comment this morning, you can reach us on medical issues this morning at 736-0300. 736-0300. I have been politely saying we're talking about some GI issues this morning. I'm pretty close, right?
It's exactly right. Um, this is something that, according to some research that's been done recently, there was a research study done in 2013 by AbbVie Pharmaceuticals and found that 74% of Americans deal with chronic GI issues. For those of you that don't know what that means has to do with the stomach and the intestines. So that's kind of a basic way of putting it, but that's what we'd like to talk about today, some of those from the mouth to the other end issues.
I was reading the other day about a Hollywood star. She's a known for playing roles. You know, very pretty woman, and I'm not going to give her name out, but she's been in a lot of well-known shows and movies. And yet she belongs to an organization. She's the lead spokesman for it because she has constant issues with this, as well as being very gassy. I guess that's a polite way to put that too. The British say breaking wind. But you wouldn't know it looking at this person who looks like $1 million, and yet this is somebody who suffers from this on a chronic basis.
Yeah, and there's no way to tell when you look at people if they deal with issues like that. It's something that, you know, everyone does. And 74% of Americans are dealing with this issue. It's covering everyone, male and female, uh, every demographic. Everyone's dealing with GI issues of sorts. So probably somebody in your family, or several people in your family, or you are dealing with GI issues. And so, it's something that most people are really uncomfortable to talk about. Honestly, I think that's the first thing that I'd like to say. And that's what the research study found is most people, they just didn't address it. And there's a lot of reasons why they didn't address it. And I think some of those are uh, probably easier to figure out than others. It's kind of uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to talk about and to admit. And so people just live with it when they could find relief and could find an answer that would help them to actually feel better and have better quality of life.
Do you think that most people, even coming into the office, once you close the door and they're just sitting in the examination room with you, are they more forthcoming, or are they still worried about bringing it up?
Yeah, I mean, there's some people that they feel like that's a safe place for them to talk about some of those issues, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it takes months to build relationships of trust with those people. Sometimes it takes years, and so it just depends on the person and what their level of comfort is, and sometimes what their level of discomfort is. Will drive them to actually bring that subject matter up and address it.
We had a kid in school. His nickname was Skeeter. I won't give his full name out because if he's listening today, he'd probably punch me. But but by sharing this, but he also had his last name was Perry. So there was a famous admiral by the name of Oliver Hazard Perry we learned about in history class. But because this young man had some issues, he got nicknamed Hazard. The middle name, you didn't want to be sitting next to him in class. In fact, one day a teacher walked by and it was embarrassing because the teacher said, "Judas Priest, young man, do you have a problem?" And it wasn't anything that he was eating that was unusual that I could notice. That was part of his, I guess, physiological makeup. And I know that I'd see his face turn beet red when things like that would happen. It was very embarrassing.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely something that I think a lot of people they when it does happen, it causes a lot of embarrassment, and that's why they don't address it is because they think, well, something's wrong with me, and everyone else is fine, but something's wrong with me, and it's just a personal issue that I have. When really, it could be something that we could address with something as easy as changing your diet. And you said you didn't notice that he was eating anything abnormal, but the thing about that is normal to you and the things that you digest normally or someone else may digest normally to someone else can cause a lot of irritation. And depending on the way that they're built, what kind of enzymes are present in the gut to help to digest foods, what kind of sensitivities they have to food, um, that can really make a world of difference as far as having those types of issues. And those are the things that I want to address today are really, well, if you're having these types of issues, everything from GERD or the gastroesophageal reflux disease, or some people just know it as really bad heartburn, to chronic diarrhea. I just want to talk about a few things that you can do in your diet, in your lifestyle, that would help you to feel a little bit better. Now, there's some things that aren't just addressed solely by lifestyle and diet changes. Those things tend to be they're pretty hot topics today, and we'll talk about some of those, I think, coming up here.
All right, we've got more with Jeremy Dalley on the way in just a few minutes. Jeremy is here, of course, from Trip Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls. And we're talking about GI issues today, gastrointestinal and other things that you might find a little bit, sometimes you might be sheepish about talking about, but we might also take some of your telephone calls if you don't mind sharing that with us. We say you don't mind because,
And you can call for a friend.
yes, you can call for a friend. That works. That's a good idea. 20 minutes now from 9 o'clock, and it's 66. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Jeremy Dalley is our studio guest this morning until 9 o'clock. He is here from Trip Family Medicine. We call it Better Health with Trip Family Medicine, located right here in Twin Falls on Fillmore Street. And, for contact information, Jeremy, people should, you send them mainly to the Facebook page, right?
Yeah, the Facebook page is a great way to see what we've been up to recently. Shalene, like I said, she does a great job of updating that on a regular basis, and even the trips have been putting some content on there for their recent trip to Nicaragua, and they're still down there, in fact, and some of the things that they've been doing as far as helping the people down there. So there's some good content on there, but we'd rather have you come to the office. It's 1411 Fillmore, just right across from the post office, like Bill said earlier. And we're accepting new patients, and we do great at getting people in for same days. We like to make sure people are seen the same day or next day if we can, and we just like taking care of people.
We have a caller with us. And caller, you're on the air with Jeremy Dalley from Trip Family Medicine.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I've got a question. I don't know if this pertains to gastro or not. I'm always wondering about hiccups, how they start, how they end. We had a kid back when I was in grade school, and his were so bad the teacher would actually have to take his desk out in the hallway so he could stop, maybe after for half an hour. So I don't know if this has something to do with what we're talking about today, or if you'd like to do another segment, that'd be fine too. Thank you.
No, I think that's actually a really interesting question. The funny thing is, I had the same conversation with my wife last night as she was going through a bout of hiccups. Really, what happens is there's a nerve that gives function to the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that sits below the lungs, and most of the time, what happens is for some reason that nerve becomes slightly irritated, the phrenic nerve, and when that happens, it causes the hiccups, and it's not really well understood exactly why it's kind of that spastic movement like that. Interesting to note, people that have chronic hiccups, sometimes we have to do a workup on them and find out if there's something actually obstructing or pressing on the phrenic nerve, and it could be dangerous actually for people that have chronic hiccups. But most of the time it's just, something that we ate, or, a little bit of irritation from digestion, something like that, that's irritating that nerve. But it's usually not anything to be worried about unless it's chronic and, it's really affecting your life.
I have some reflux issues, and they can often sometimes, I think, mimic hiccups. Not as long. I mean, you don't get a long stretch of them, but things happen, and it sounds as if you've got a hiccup that's taking place.
Yeah, probably just a little bit of spastic motion, either in the esophagus or the stomach, that makes you feel like you're going to hiccup, or maybe temporarily feel like you're going to hiccup. But I think a lot of times it's just irritation to the esophagus or to the stomach that causes that.
I know a lot of people out there, who've had the hiccups, and of course, if you get them one day and you haven't had them in 6 months, you'll likely get them, it seems to me, 2 or 3 times in a week, and then they'll go away again for 6 months. But if you've got issues like reflux and you've got issues with, as you say, some of this is related to diet, we get back to the fact that this is not just one of those things that, because everyone, even if you don't have reflux, you get occasional or periodic heartburn. I mean, it depends on what you might eat out at a restaurant or if you eat too much. But we're talking about people who, I mean, it is suffering every day with all of this.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And something that is chronic, something that's long lasting like this, it can really adversely affect your health. Speaking of reflux, a lot of people they deal with that on a regular basis, and most of it, I think people would agree with me, is we like to eat certain foods. We like to eat a certain way.
Hmm.
And that's really the biggest issue with reflux. We have a sphincter at the bottom of the esophagus. It's called the lower esophageal sphincter. And when the sphincter is basically subjected to either high acid content from the stomach, food that tends to sit in there a little bit longer, like fatty foods, you can have stomach contents, specifically hydrochloric acid, the stomach acid that we talk about, come up the esophagus and sometimes into the mouth, which can be, quite unpleasant. But the real issue is that this happening chronically um, can cause changes in the cells in the lower part of the esophagus, and some people develop what's called Barrett's esophagus. It's precancerous changes to the lower part of the esophagus, so it's not something to mess with. I guess is the point. And if it's something as simple as cutting back on spicy foods or chocolate or acidic foods that, things like oranges and grapefruits and sodas that have phosphoric acid or citric acid in them, all those things really can contribute to reflux. High fatty meals, that's another thing that we see cause a lot of reflux, and just eating large quantities of food can predispose people to having reflux. So having smaller portions can aid in that as well.
We have as we mentioned, there's some of these topics make people a little queasy, but they happen. A friend of mine has tended bar at his dad's American Legion post for 25 years, and told me the story one time about he had a regular who would come into the bar, and the guy would sit there and drink several beers every night and then go home. And he said that the guy was in one day and he'd been to see his doctor, and the doctor asked him a question about his stool, and he said to the doctor, "Oh, I haven't had one of those in 25 years." Um, Obviously, that was related to the fact that all of that. I guess is it the carbohydrate or whatever that he's ingesting with all of those beers that he's drinking? Is that responsible for that? I mean, or is it the liquid content?
Yeah, sometimes it's alcohol. Alcohol is somewhat of a carbohydrate, and it's broken down in the body, and sometimes will draw fluid into the colon. And so some people that have problems with that will develop chronic diarrhea because they're drinking a lot. Sometimes we worry about when it comes to people that drink a large quantity of alcohol, we worry about their pancreas actually not functioning well. When the pancreas doesn't do its job the way that we want it to, it doesn't digest fat or even carbohydrate. There's a couple of enzymes that it secretes. One being lipase. Lipase is this enzyme that breaks down fatty foods, and then the other being amylase, an enzyme that breaks down carbohydrate. And when those aren't working, your digestion is a lot different than it should be. So people end up having what's called steatorrhea or fatty stools, and it can be very unpleasant. As far as having a lot of bloating and gas because of those things, and so that can be a sign that the pancreas isn't working the way that we want it to. So that's something to look out for. As far as other problems that I always think people need to come in for, and sometimes people they kind of put these off because the same thing, they're just uncomfortable. Coming in for um, chronic diarrhea is something that can be an issue, or intermittent constipation and diarrhea, kind of going back between the two. Some hot topics today: celiac disease, which is
Hmm.
gluten intolerance. Gluten is a protein found in wheat, rye, and barley. And when people consume that on a regular basis, it takes the what usually looks like a plush carpet of the intestines and turns it into more of a linoleum floor. Just doesn't absorb anything, and so you end up having, sometimes painful diarrhea, and sometimes blood in the stool. And those are signs of pretty serious issues. And that can be basically alleviated by avoiding those types of food products.
We have another caller with us. And caller, you're on the air on Better Health with Trip Family Medicine with Jeremy Dalley.
Yeah, I had a question. I've had a long-standing um, concern about slow digestion combined with a lot of air. I must either swallow a lot of air or somehow my GI system is producing a lot of air as it digests. So I end up having to belch a lot, to get rid of the air. So I wondered if you had any experience with that. I've had a lower GI done. There's nothing that they could see. Um, so I was wondering if you had any insight.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. As far as the other symptoms that you're having, I mean, is there anything like um, burning or pain after you eat, or is it just really the that sensation that you have a lot of air and belching?
I would say maybe a little bit of heartburn, but I would say it's pretty minimal.
Uh-huh. Now, what about something like H. pylori? Did they mention that to you at all?
No, they didn't. And I know about that a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
they didn't mention anything like that.
And that's something that's real common, and we can test for it a couple of different ways. Sometimes through a breath test. It's called a urease breath test, and we can do that in the office. And basically, what we do is we see if you're producing this specific enzyme, and helps us to know if the H. pylori, which it's actually this bacteria that can cause peptic ulcer disease. It's the most common cause of peptic ulcer disease. So if we diagnose you with that, which a lot of times the symptoms are, a little bit of reflux, feeling like you're belching a lot more than you usually are. So that's one thing that it could be. The other thing that we talk about is, gas producing foods, and sometimes it's foods that people really think about. There's some vegetables that tend to be gas producing foods that people are really familiar with. But there's a diet that I'd like to talk about quickly that I think is actually pretty good for people who are suffering from what seems like food intolerance or sometimes chronic GI issues where they're having maybe reflux or they're having chronic diarrhea or constipation, any of those issues. I'd like to just kind of talk about this diet briefly, and it's called the FODMAP diet, and it stands for fermentable oligodimonosaccharides and polyols, which is definitely a mouthful, but
Which
really
is why
what
you
it's
go with the acronym.
exactly the FODMAP diet. And really, what we're trying to do is reduce foods that are gas producing foods, that are highly fermentable by the gut and that tend to cause these chronic issues. So really, what it addresses is avoidance of things like lactose. So lactose is the sugar that's found in milk products. So avoiding things like buttermilk and chocolate and cheeses and milk, goats and sheep milk even as well are things that we avoid on this diet. Other things that are interesting to note, there's some types of fruits and vegetables that you should avoid that are highly fermentable by the gut. Something that kind of goes against that old "an apple a day keeps the doctor away" saying. Apples are highly fermentable, so you actually on this diet you avoid apples, apricots, blackberries, dried fruit, mangoes, nectarines, papayas, and even some of the vegetables, artichokes, cauliflower, mushrooms, sugar snap peas. So there's a few things on there that people may not even know they're eating, and they think this is a good food, and typically it is, but they can be highly fermentable by the gut and produce a lot of gas, bloating, discomfort, and so it's something that we like to try. It's easy, we well, it's not easy. Let me put it this way: it's a simple fix, but it's not easy to make that big of a diet modification sometimes, and so it can take effort. But people that I've seen a lot of people do really well with this. Just it doesn't work for everyone, obviously, because sometimes problems are a little bit worse than just a food intolerance. But when it is that, this is a great diet to start out with, just to kind of trial for about 6 weeks and see how you do.
and a lot of people probably end up staying on it, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes we'll slowly add in certain food groups like gluten back in, and if people do well on that, then we say, hey, probably wasn't gluten, or maybe it wasn't, maybe it was one of those fruits or vegetables that was the issue, and so we'll advise people to stay on that diet if they feel better. Most people, they would like to feel better, and so they have more motivation to stick with this type of a diet.
One more time for people who'd like to get in touch with the office, how do they go about doing that?
You can give us a call at 933-4400, or you can get a hold of us on Facebook. Our page is constantly being updated. And, just come into the office right in front of the post office and see us. We'd love to take care of you.
Jeremy Dalley, we want to thank you for coming by. Jeremy's a physician assistant from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls. And in the rotation, we'll probably see you about a month from now.
Sounds great.
Yeah. All right. We have a mention quickly that we look like we have Steve Yates sometime in the next hour. He's the chairman of the Idaho Republican Party, giving us an update from the Republican National Convention where he is at in Cleveland. This has been kind of dicey because he's in and out of meetings, but we may be able to chat with him just after 9:20 this morning, right here on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.